My name is Sarah. This is joint work with myself and my advisor, Mayank Varia. So I'm going to talk about how we used a method from cryptography to deepen our understanding of the Fifth Amendment and the foregone conclusion doctrine, which I'll talk about what that is. And we're going to use that then to reason about compelled decryption. So this talk is going to be exactly the kind of thing that James was just talking about, and it's going to be full of, legal language ambiguity or lack thereof. And on the technical side, I'm going to skip over the more programming parts of computer science and go straight to math, which is pretty much as close to fully specified as we could hope for. And as we'll see, actually, if we focus in on certain lines of natural language written in, case law, that will strongly invoke certain mathematical ideas, but then which particular lines of the language we choose to focus in on might lead to different mathematical interpretations. So this is a great thing to follow the previous discussion. And I should also say that this is a paper that was recently accepted to Usenix Security 2021. Okay, so let me get right into it. First of all, what do I mean by compelled decryption? So we imagine this scenario, which is happening more and more, both as part of normal law enforcement and also as sort of in a court process. So we imagine the compelled decryption scenario as an interactive protocol where the government orders a respondent to decrypt a phone or a laptop or a device of some kind. The respondent pleads the fifth, and the government attempts to provide a rationale as to why the respondent should be forced to decrypt the device anyway. And I won't get into it, but it is the government who has the burden of proof to show that they can compel the respondent. So the government's power to compel people to do actions is limited by the Fifth Amendment, which says, in part, that no person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. So this makes it seem like a very clear-cut thing, but as we all know, this limitation is not absolute. So this privilege against self-incrimination only extends to actions that are all three of compelled, incriminating, and testimonial. And the first two are relatively self-explanatory, but this last one of testimony deserves a deeper dive. So for the next 25 minutes, a testimony means something that discloses the contents of your own mind. So let's set aside everything to do with cryptography and let's just talk about the general legal theory of testimony. And this is actually pretty well established at this point, as far as I can tell. So the first way an action might be testimony that's protected under the Fifth Amendment, meaning it is not compellable, is if the output of the action directly reveals the contents of your mind. So if you're forced to write down how you committed a crime, that's direct testimony, and you don't have to be compelled to say that or to write that. But additionally, an action can be protected even if the output isn't testimonial, but it's possible to infer something about your beliefs based on how you perform the action. So for instance, let's suppose the government subpoenas you to produce a gun if you have one. Your response to the subpoena implicitly testifies as to whether or not you have a gun, because if you don't have one, you'll come back with 0 guns, and if you have one, you'll come back with a gun. And that implicit testimony is still protected under the Fifth Amendment, but there is an additional layer of subtlety, which is that the government can compel an action anyway if its implicit testimonial aspects are what's called a foregone conclusion, meaning that they, quote, add little or nothing to the sum total of the government's information. So in my gun example, if the government already knew that you had a gun, then they can subpoena you to produce the gun, and that's no longer protected under the Fifth Amendment, because even though that action has implicit testimony, the implicit testimony, all the testimonial aspects of that action are something that the government already knew. So this is called the foregone conclusion doctrine. It was born in 1976, in this case, Fisher v. U.S., and I should just add to clarify that all of this is Fifth Amendment stuff, and this is mostly separate from the Fourth Amendment questions of to what extent the government is allowed to search your house for a gun. This is only asking the question of what the government can compel you to do. So why are we as cryptographers interested in this topic? So first, because the latest iteration of the crypto wars is about compelled decryption. So the previous iterations of what's colloquially called the crypto wars are about things like setting minimum key lengths or enforcing key escrow or instructing manufacturers to assist in unlocking phones that they've made. And all of these arguments generally involve around the Fourth Amendment and the All Writs Act and other areas of the law. But this newer tactic, this like Fifth Amendment centric tactic, has been happening more and more, of compelling you to use your knowledge of the password to unlock the device and provide the decrypted data to the government. So as cryptographers, we're interested in this question partly because we're interested in the crypto wars more broadly. But second, because we also have a slightly different perspective and a different way of looking at the problem than the law folks. So the courts are currently divided as to whether or not you can be compelled to log into your device or provide a passcode or a biometric or so on. So there's a bunch of state Supreme Courts and a circuit court that say that passwords or entry of the password can be compelled. There's a bunch that say that it can't be compelled. All of this is further complicated by the government asking for different things. Some of them ask for disclosure of the password. Some of them only ask for entry of the password. Courts aren't sure what to do with biometrics. All of this is in a very muddled state. And it's expected that the Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court, is going to take a case on this soon to try to provide some kind of guidance. So we also hope that our computer science perspective is helpful in untangling this situation. So in this work, we're going to start from the observation that the legal definitions that I presented on the previous slide of implicit testimony and foregone conclusion, these ideas are remarkably similar to cryptography definitions that have been around for decades that provide a formal definition of what it actually means to learn nothing new or to learn something implicitly. And that's going to be the starting point. And I also want to just clarify that the purpose of this work is not to specify what we think the foregone doctrine or foregone conclusion doctrine should be. We're just trying to figure out what the current doctrine actually is, because that's not actually clear right now. Okay, so we make three main contributions in this paper. So first, we provide a candidate cryptographic definition of a foregone conclusion. So this is like a math definition of a foregone conclusion, which I'll describe shortly. Then we use that definition to determine whether various cryptographic or non-cryptographic objects can be compelled. So we'll try to look at the question of compelled decryption. And it'll also let us think about future questions, like whether the government can force you to encrypt something. And then last, we'll use that definition again, and we'll ask, we're security researchers, so can we build a protocol where, regardless of what the first part definition is, can we build a protocol where the secrets cannot be compelled? And this last bit is going to involve a lot of passwords, which is unfortunate because the security community has been trying to get away from passwords. Okay, so let me begin with the first definition of a foregone conclusion in general. And in fact, I'm first going to provide a very basic introduction to cryptographic simulation for those who haven't seen it before. And our entire definition is going to be based around this idea of a formalization of what it means to not learn anything new. Okay, so if you're hearing this word simulation and you're not a cryptographer, you're probably slightly confused, but cryptographers use the word simulation to mean something different than sort of the typical technical meaning. So in cryptography, a simulator is a way of figuring out what is learned by a party executing a protocol. So let's say we have Alice interacting with Bob using some kind of protocol where as they talk to each other, Alice is not supposed to learn anything new. Okay, so what does that mean? How can we be sure that Alice isn't learning anything new from this protocol? Well, if Alice didn't learn any new information from Bob, then she actually didn't have to interact with Bob at all in order to get something that looks pretty similar. So she could have simulated the whole interaction herself. So we build this thing called a simulator, which I'm representing by this purple box. And the simulator's result, if the simulator's result matches the transcript of the protocol with Bob, and by this I mean they were computationally indistinguishable, then Alice must have learned nothing new by running this protocol, because she didn't even need to interact with him in order to produce something that looked pretty similar, and we couldn't tell the difference between sort of the simulated version and the actual interaction with Bob. So this is going to form the core of our foregone conclusion definition. We're going to require the government to simulate the act of production, but not the contents produced, of whatever thing it is the government wants you to produce. And if the government is capable of simulating this compelled action without using the contents of the respondent's mind, then this action didn't add anything testimonial to the, quote, sum total of the government's information. And so we're going to say the result is a foregone conclusion. So I'm going to give an example to illustrate this definition, and this is where I'm going to provide the actual foregone conclusion definition. And I'll say ahead of time that we tested this definition out on many non-encryption foregone conclusion cases, and we got the same answer as the courts. And this is just one example. So, okay, so let's say we have a specific compelled action that the government wants the respondents to do. It might be, you know, bring me these documents, bring me your tax documents from last year or something like that. So we say there are three entities. There's the respondents, who are the ones who are being asked to do the action. And the respondents want to show that whatever this compelled action is, it inherently discloses the contents of their mind, and thus this should be protected under the Fifth Amendment, and they should not have to be compelled. The government then claims that whatever this action is, it's a foregone conclusion, and it doesn't rely on the contents of the respondent's mind, and therefore they should be compelled to do the action. And then last, we have this third box of nature. And nature is meant to represent every single thing in the entire world except for the respondent's mind. So we have this you know, we have everything in the entire world split into two parts. One part is whatever's in the respondent's mind, which is testimonial, and one part is nature, which is everything else. So this particular example is from US v. Bright, which is a Ninth Circuit case from 2010. So in this case, basically the IRS knew that the respondents, Sherry and Benjamin Bright, had two credit cards with offshore banks, and they could authenticate them. And they compelled the production of both the two known accounts and also, you know, quote, any other offshore credit cards. And so the court's ruling was that production of the documents for the two known accounts was a foregone conclusion, and production of the documents for the any other accounts was not a foregone conclusion. And we're going to see how you would use our definition to get to the same result. Okay, so I said we're going to use simulation to check this adds nothing to the government's knowledge thing. So the compelled action can use any combination of the things in nature and the things in the respondent's mind to produce its result. This is just whatever the government wants you to do. You know where your papers are, go get them, bring them here. The simulator is going to be required to produce a computationally indistinguishable result, but only using nature and not using the contents of the respondent's mind. And I'll note that this is still more powerful than the government might be in the real world. So in the real world, the government probably can't access everything in the world except the respondent's mind. Maybe the government can't crack a safe or can't request documents from offshore banks. But in this case, like, to figure out this foregone conclusion question, right now the only thing we care about is just whether or not it reveals the contents of the mind, and not whether or not the not what the sort of jurisdictional issues are. We're just trying to tease out whether there is something testimonial in here. For computer scientists, all of these are Turing machines that are PPT in a parameter that you should think of as like the amount of evidence. So, okay, we say a compelled action is a foregone conclusion with regards to the simulator and this E thing that I'll explain in a little bit, if the compelled action's results with access to both nature and the respondent's mind are indistinguishable from the simulator's results using only nature. But the next question is, like, where does this nature thing come from? Oops. Where does this nature thing come from? right, the whole point is that the government might not know in advance whether or not a certain document exists, and the respondent, coming up to bring these documents might have just implicitly testified to their existence if the government didn't already know in advance that those existed. So for example, maybe the Brights only had those 2 offshore credit card accounts, or maybe they had 10 offshore credit card accounts. So we allow the respondent to do what we call equivocation and set the contents of nature and its own mind ahead of time. And the point is that this equivocation gives the respondent the ability to ensure that the government can't compel it to reveal anything, any secret documents if it didn't know about them in advance. So this indistinguishability result must hold for all settings of respondent and nature, except those that we know to be untrue. So if the government knows, for example, that you already have 2 credit card accounts, then the respondent cannot equivocate to a world where it only has 1. We just automatically prevent them from doing that. So in the Brights case, the evidence consisted of IRS agent testimony as to 2 known accounts at offshore banks with specific account numbers, and they had bank officials that were capable of authenticating any documents that were returned. So in this case, if the Brights had tried to equivocate and say, oh, well, I'm only going to bring you 1 set of credit card documents, the government already knows you have 2, so this is sort of the respondent automatically loses here. Or if they tried to forge some of the documents, the government has this authentication ability baked into its evidence, and so it knows that if the respondents tried to use forged documents, they would be able to check, and the respondent would automatically lose. So going back to this example, right, we had these 2 different parts of the subpoena. We had the subpoena for the 2 known sets of documents and the ones for sort of any other documents. Let's suppose these were 2 separate actions. Like first we're going to compel the 2 known accounts, and then we're going to compel the possible remaining accounts. So our definition is going to agree with the court's ruling here. So if you had just queried, if you had just tried to compel production of the documents for the 2 known accounts, the government can simulate that by getting the results directly from nature. Nothing about that is in the respondent's mind. Like maybe the method of getting them is in the respondent's mind, but that doesn't matter because the government has a separate way of getting them that doesn't matter. So right, if you had just made a compelled action request for the 2 known accounts, the governments can simulate that by getting the documents directly from nature. And we know that they must be in nature because any setting where they're not was disallowed by the evidence. Okay, so we agree with this on this half of the ruling, and then what about the other half? So if instead the government, queried for, produce the documents for any other account, and we have no idea how many accounts you have, then, it's not really clear how the government would simulate this. In fact, for any, for any simulator, it's probable that the respondents would be able to sort of equivocate to a world where that simulator wouldn't work. And this matches up with the sort of intuitive idea that in this case, the response to the subpoena is implicitly testifying to the existence of these other accounts. Okay, so hopefully we're all moderately happy with this definition, and if we're not, you can fight me in the Q&A afterward. So for existing legal court cases, we can sort of translate the legal case into this formalization, and we can see what the result is and check to make sure that we got the same result as the courts. So this is the evidence check in Fisher v. US. And I'll actually point out something interesting, which is that if you apply this sort of holistic simulation idea to Fisher, which is the origin of the foregone conclusion doctrine, in fact, exactly what falls out of the evidence that is required in order to be able to compel this are exactly 3 things. It's the existence of the papers, it's their location or their approximate location, and their authenticity. And that's really interesting because those are the three prongs that the sort of legal side of this typically uses to determine whether something's a foregone conclusion. So Fisher spawned this like three-prong test of existence, location / possession, and authenticity. And it just so happens that if you apply this simulation idea to Fisher, that's exactly what falls out. So we consider this simulation-based idea to be sort of a generalization of Fisher, where yes, exactly the implicit testimony that leaked in Fisher were these three things, but in different cases, there might be, fewer or more than those three things, or different three things that were actually implicitly testified to. And with this holistic simulation idea, we can get a feel for what those are. And I'm going to dwell on one more subtlety for anybody in the legal side who is worrying about this. So typically the contents of any produced documents are not protected under the Fifth Amendment. Only the act of producing those documents is protected. This is usually because the creation of the documents was not compelled, or sometimes the documents themselves are not testimonial. And our method preserves this requirement. So right, any sort of document thing lives in nature, not in the respondent's mind. And so both the simulator and the compelled action are going to be able to have access to it. So the simulator doesn't need, to simulate the contents. It only needs to be able to simulate the method of producing those contents, so the act of production. So this lines up pretty well with what we think the legal side of it is. Okay. So next I'm going to briefly describe some of the consequences that this definition would have for compelling crypto, so like compelled decryption. And compelled decryption is probably the most important one. The scenario here is that there is a phone or a laptop in nature at a known location, which is encrypted using a password held only in the respondent's mind. And the compelled action is to provide the decrypted contents of the laptop. So we don't, we're not asking the respondent to say the password. We're asking the respondent to use their password to decrypt and then provide the decryption. And we find that generally decryption is not compellable under this definition because decryption can't really be simulated except for a couple of exceptions. So there are times when the simulator would be able to produce these results, and roughly speaking, you can break them down into one category where you could produce the secret key from nature. And I'll talk more about why this might be in a second. One category where the result could have actually been produced only using information in nature and evidence. And so you didn't actually need the password in order to describe it, even if the non-password way of getting it was really annoying. And then third, like most crypto reductions, the third option is that if the simulator can reliably reproduce a matching result, then the government might just be able to break crypto. This same idea applies to similar cryptographic operations like opening a commitment or providing a preimage to a hash or other things like that. So I want to point out that this key might be a nature thing, or you might be able to produce the result from nature, actually happens quite a bit in practice, and it's not always a bad thing. So the security community has been trying for years and years to get away from passwords for a lot of reasons. But in this particular use case, when we're talking about the foregone conclusion doctrine, it seems like there's really something special about passwords. So for instance, what about biometrics? A lot of courts are trying to make lump biometrics, like a fingerprint used to log into a computer, and passwords into the same bucket. But at least looking at it through this lens, they're actually quite different, because the biometric is part of the world that is not your mind, and the password is something that was in your mind. So that's a reason that the key might be in nature, or the secret might be in nature. Same idea for a hardware security module kind of thing. I'm going to talk more about multi-party computation later, but I want to dwell also on this point of a manufacturer device key. So an interesting finding of this interpretation, at least, is that this sort of compelled decryption definition composes very badly with other areas of the crypto wars, because if, for instance, there existed some kind of master key or device key or manufacturer key held by, Apple or law enforcement or the courts. If this key existed, then it would be possible to simulate the decrypted results of a compelled decryption request from just nature and the evidence, because you could use this alternate key. You didn't have to go through the person's mind. And if that were the case, we think that the person themselves could be compelled to decrypt. So because the other method exists, you can be compelled to decrypt, and that's an interesting finding. Let me also talk a little bit about this ZKPOK thing. So one other thing that this definition lets us ask is, can the government force a respondent to encrypt a secret? Why would the government want to do this? I don't know about encryption specifically, but something it might want a respondent to do is to do a zero knowledge proof or a zero knowledge proof of knowledge. So it's been proposed for security reasons that instead of logging into, let's say, a website with a password, we should use a zero knowledge proof of our identity. So let's suppose some website uses this login mechanism, and let's just suppose that the government it wants more than just the static data. It actually wants to be able to log in as you. So can they compel this zero knowledge proof? So if you remember, a proof is called zero knowledge if nothing is learned from running the proof except for the one bit of output that the proof was convincing. So like that they actually had whatever it was that you were testing them to have. So if the government already knew that, so they already knew that you could log in, then it does seem under this definition that they could compel an entire zero knowledge proof of that fact by running the simulator for the zero knowledge proof. And this is interesting because it seems to be true even though they couldn't have compelled the thing that would otherwise be required to log in, namely a password. So that's interesting. And we're going to use this idea of compelled encryption for the third part of this talk as well. Okay, so let me switch gears one more time and think about constructive things we can do as security researchers. So forget about whether or not you agree or disagree with me on the definition that I talked about in part one. Let's suppose we all agree on just a definition of what a foregone conclusion is. So now I want to ask the question, okay, under that definition, can I build a protocol where the secrets cannot be compelled? So this is a different question than what we've been talking about before. What I talked about before asks whether a current compelled action is, or a current action is compellable based on past actions and past evidence. And this new thing, which I'm going to call FC resilient, asks whether I just want to go about my daily life and run crypto protocols. And my question is the act of running those crypto protocols opening me up to being compelled to reveal something about my secrets that it would not otherwise have if I had not run that protocol? Yeah. So we define the notion of FC resilience like this. So informally, we're going to say a protocol is FC resilient if it does not create new compellable foregone conclusions. And how do we show this? We want to show that everything in the world that is compellable after running the protocol was already compellable before we ran the protocol. And we're going to do this by identifying what changes the protocol makes to both nature and the contents of your mind. And we're going to show that anything that was added to nature sort of could already have been compelled. And we're going to use this compelled encryption idea to show that, even if you can be compelled to reveal something after the protocol, you were actually already revealed to do something before that. Can you hear me? I can hear somebody else talking. Okay, I'm just going to keep going. And I'm going to make one exception, which is during a time when you are actively typing your password into your computer in order to use it. So except for when you are actively using the contents of your mind, I'm going to say that we can't be compelled to reveal something in the middle of that step. But at any other time, except during these sort of actively entering the password times, the government could just swoop in and say, okay, halt the protocol. Now I'm going to ask you some kind of new action about your secrets. Okay, so let's talk about secure multi-party computation. This is a general term for a computation where several parties want to compute together on their data, but they don't want to reveal their data to each other. So if this person has X and this person has Y and this person has Z, they all want to compute F of X, Y, Z, but nobody wants to reveal, this person doesn't want to reveal X and this person doesn't want to reveal Y and Z. So we might think that because MPC provides privacy, we might think that it also provides FC resilience. But that turns out not to be true for two reasons. So first of all, MPC provides privacy for everything except the output. And it's assumed that, everybody agrees on whatever outputs the parties are going to learn. But in this case, now the fact that the output was gotten by somebody who is not the one party that we care about means that that is now a new compellable action that wasn't compellable beforehand, because somebody can approach this person and say, we're investigating this party who I'll call P star, tell us the output of the protocol. And so that's a new thing that was compellable that wasn't compellable before running the protocol. So for today's talk, I'm going to focus on outsourced protocols where these two parties on the right are just helping P star compute, and P star is the only one that's going to get output. We have some ideas about how to get output for everybody for a limited class of functions, but I'm starting to run low on time, so I will probably not talk about it in this talk. The second reason that MPC is also not just automatically FC resilient is more boring, which is that most computations are not run in your head, where you're doing whatever cryptographic operation you need to do to the input. Usually it's just sort of done by a computer. So we need some way to inject the contents of P star's mind into this MPC protocol, probably at every round, or some way that it'll impact the entire protocol. Oops. Okay, so we could resolve this issue sort of very easily from a theory crypto sense, which is that we could use something called fully homomorphic encryption. So P star could outsource its computation by encrypting it with an FHE scheme, which allows the other parties to run some kind of evaluation on the encrypted data. So nobody ever learned any secret of P stars. People that were not P star only ever saw encryption, like ciphertext. They never saw plain text. And this works. The key insight here is that the new info, like the new things that were added to nature, namely the ciphertext, were already compellable because encryption was already compellable. So this does work, but it's sort of annoying. First of all, because FHE is sort of heavy, and secondly, because in order for this to work, P star would have to re-enter the password every round in order to decrypt. So that's annoying. So we can do better, at least for two-party computation. So we have a construction for achieving FC resilience for the garbler, for garbled circuits, which maintains its other security properties. And during this, you only have to enter your password 3 times, regardless of how long the computation is. And since I am running a little low on time, I won't say much more about it, but I am happy to chat about it later. And obviously you can check the paper if you are interested in this kind of thing. And I'll skip this too. Okay, so let me just, I've talked about the 3 things I said I was going to talk about, but I want to dwell a little bit more on this question of mathematical definitions from legal definitions, and this point that James was talking about the, sort of the interplay between these two. So the biggest difficulty in all of these kinds of work is finding the right definition. So this talk and also the accompanying paper are using this blue definition for the foregone conclusion doctrine. So we keyed in on this one key phrase, which is adding to the sum total of the government's knowledge. And we said, oh, we're cryptographers. We know how knowledge works. We can definitely say something about when an action does or does not add to the sum total of the government's knowledge. So that's what we did in this work. But we could have chosen to zero in on a different phrase in the same paragraph, in the same defining paragraph of Fisher v. US, this like birth of the foregone conclusion doctrine, which is this phrase about relying on the truth-telling of the defendant. So we can imagine scenarios where, even though the government can't simulate the result, perhaps they do not have to, quote, rely on the truth-telling. So let me give you an example. So if we imagine that the respondent is computationally bounded, let's say we know that they have exactly one preimage to a hash function, or to a hash from a cryptographic hash function, and roughly what this means, and we want them to produce it, right? This is not simulatable because you can't simulate the preimage to a hash, but in some sense the respondent wouldn't be strongly able to lie. Like, lying would be computationally hard if they wanted to provide a different preimage that would also hash to the same image. So in some sense, that would mean we're not relying on their truth-telling because we would know it would cost too much work for them to tell a lie. So unfortunately, all of the existing non-encryption cases that we've seen live in the intersection where they're sort of covered by both forms of the definition. So this is actually a question for like the legal people here, right? So should something not be compellable only if it adds to the sum total of the government's information? Should it be only if it relies on R's truth-telling? Should it be uncompellable if either of these two definitions is met, where we take sort of a union, or if they're both met, where we take just the intersection? Like, which of these things is it, right? So we're doing ongoing work with Aloni Cohen, who I think is also talking later today on a different topic, to understand this problem better. And it's definitely an interesting one to do. Okay, so I am happy to take questions. I will also be around for the entire workshop, and I'm happy to chat about this or anything else. And I'll also just casually mention that I'm tentatively planning to graduate in the spring or summer, so I'm also looking into potential job opportunities. I'm happy to talk about that too. But for now, let's stick to foregone conclusions. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Let's give Sarah a round of applause. Right. So I see there are two questions in the Q&A box, so we can have Sarah help us with those first, and then if people have other questions. The first one is, what's the legal position on facial recognition?
Oh man, okay. So I don't know about any kind of facial recognition thing that has to do with this particular work and the sort of the Fifth Amendment questions or the foregone conclusion questions. So all of this will be from just other general knowledge. I don't know if there is a federal, any kind of federal statement on facial recognition. In fact, I think there is not. I do know Illinois has a biometric law now that seems to say something about you need explicit consent every time I'm probably going to mangle this horribly. I think you need explicit consent every time you're going to either collect or use, I forget which, I think collect a biometric, but then maybe facial identifications, like maybe Facebook's tagging algorithm counts. So I'm not sure what happened there. As far as I know, the US doesn't have a consistent legal stance on facial recognition. A handful of cities have banned facial recognition in surveillance and for law enforcement, and and then the Illinois thing, but I don't know about anything more central than that. Then the question, yes, this is a good one. So Prashant asks whether the cost of the simulation matters. So if simulating some information that the government can learn from me is possible from nature, but takes much more resources, what implications would that have? And I am so glad you asked. So we model in this, we're modeling the simulator as polynomially bounded in sort of the amount of evidence, but with a lower bound to make it not be really small when it's not supposed to be. And I actually want to argue that there's a legal interpretation for why we should think that the simulator is bounded. And it actually falls within this location prong of the 3-prong Fisher test. So the legal interpretation of the foregone conclusion doctrine right now is something is a foregone conclusion if its existence, location, and authenticity are already known. And it's sort of implied that like these are the only implicit testimonial actions that could ever be leaked from an act of production. And I want to argue that because the location prong is there, this nods to the idea of a bound on what the government's power is. Because if the location or possession prong wasn't there, you know, if the government was sort of allowed to search the entire world for whatever the documents were, then it wouldn't have mattered what the like that prong wouldn't have existed in some sense. So we did it as a polynomial time bound. Maybe it should be a concrete bound instead. Maybe we're thinking about that in the back of our heads too. But I do want to argue that there is actually like a legal, what's the word, sort of inspiration for why there should be a bound at all and why we shouldn't just let the simulator run as long as it wants.